The night had settled heavy over the small town, a night that promised nothing more than the usual noise and mischief at the Iron Claw Biker Bar. Inside, the place was alive with energy, the sound of laughter rising above the roar of the jukebox and the clinking of beer bottles. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and grease, a haze that curled lazily in the dim light, while men in leather vests leaned against the scarred wooden counters or gathered around pool tables. These were men who wore their roughness openly, with tattoos crawling up their arms and scars telling stories of battles they never cared to explain. For them, this was just another night, another excuse to drink, to argue, and to feel invincible in their little kingdom away from the rest of the world. Then the door creaked open, and in that single sound, the entire atmosphere shifted. The rowdy voices lowered, then fell completely silent as every head turned toward the entrance. What they saw was not a rival biker or a police officer, but something no one in the room could have predicted. A little girl, no older than 7, stood in the doorway. Her hair was tangled, strands falling into her frightened eyes. Dirt streaked her cheeks, and her small shoes were muddy, as if she had been running for a long time. In her arms, she clutched a faded pink backpack, holding it tight against her chest as if it was her last line of defense against the world. The contrast was striking. A child in a place built for men who thrived on chaos and danger. Her small figure looked even smaller against the backdrop of leather jackets and steel chains hanging from belts. The bikers froze, unsure what to make of her. The girl's chest heaved as she caught her breath, and her wide eyes darted nervously around the room as though she expected someone to burst in after her at any moment. Finally, one of the men broke the silence. Razor, tall and broad, shouldered, with a scar slashing across his cheek, stepped forward. He was known for his harshness, a man people crossed the street to avoid. Yet something in the sight of the girl softened the edges of his expression. His voice, still gruff, came low and careful. "Hey, kid, you lost. Where are your parents?" The girl shook her head violently, clutching the backpack tighter, her knuckles turning white. "No, I can't go back. They'll find me. Please don't make me go back." Her voice cracked, and the room seemed to grow heavier with each word. The bikers exchanged glances, a silent conversation of disbelief. They were men who knew trouble when they saw it, and this little girl was drenched in it. But her fear wasn't the kind that came from getting lost or wandering too far from home. This was something deeper, something that made even these hardened men uneasy. Big Joe, the oldest of the bunch, with a thick beard that made him look like a grizzly bear, crouched down so he wouldn't tower over her. His voice was deep but gentle. "You're safe here, sweetheart. Nobody's gonna hurt you, but you need to tell us what's happening." Her lips trembled. For a moment, it looked like she might stay silent, too scared to trust them. Then her eyes fell to the pink backpack, and she hugged it closer as though remembering something important. Slowly, she pushed it forward, sliding it across the dusty wooden floor toward Razor. Her small voice came out in a whisper, barely loud enough to hear. "It's in there. You have to see it." The room tightened with tension. What could possibly be inside a child's backpack that would carry such fear in her voice? The bikers leaned in closer as Razor crouched, his big hands reaching for the zipper. The sound of the metal teeth pulling apart seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the bar. Every man held his breath, the dim light catching the nervous flickers in their eyes. The little girl's hands fidgeted, her body trembling as though she might run again at any moment. She kept her gaze fixed on the bag, her chest rising and falling in quick bursts. It was clear that whatever was inside was the reason she had risked stepping into this place, the reason she had begged strangers who looked like monsters to protect her. Razor glanced briefly at Big Joe, then back at the girl, as if silently asking for permission. She gave the faintest nod. With that, he opened the bag fully and peered inside. His face, usually unreadable, shifted ever so slightly. His brows furrowed, his lips pressed tight, and his shoulders stiffened. The other bikers leaned forward, trying to see. Razor slowly pulled something out of the backpack, and the bar grew eerily still. The usual noise and bravado drained away by the weight of the moment. What he held in his hands wasn't anything they had expected. The girl's eyes welled up, and she whispered again, her voice shaking but determined, "That's why I came here. That's why I need you. Please, don't let them find me." The men who prided themselves on being unshakable felt a chill ripple through them. They had no idea what storm had just blown into their bar, but in that moment, they all understood one thing. Whatever trouble this little girl was carrying in her pink backpack, it had now become theirs. Razor's scarred hands tightened around the zipper as he pulled the pink backpack wider open, and the room seemed to shrink in silence. Every biker in the Iron Claw bar leaned forward, their eyes narrowing, waiting to see what had driven a terrified little girl into their den. Inside the bag, there were no toys, no crayons, nothing that belonged to an ordinary 7-year-old. Instead, the first thing Razor lifted out was a crumpled photograph, the edges worn and creased from being handled too many times. In the picture, the little girl was standing beside a woman with kind eyes, but those eyes were shadowed by a bruise that stretched across her cheek. Her smile was faint, as if forced for the sake of the child in her arms. Razor turned the photograph around for the others to see, and the bikers, hardened as they were, shifted uncomfortably. Beneath the photograph was an envelope. When Razor opened it, stacks of cash spilled out, old bills bound loosely with a rubber band. The bikers exchanged glances, the weight of the money raising questions none of them wanted to ask out loud. Before anyone could comment, Razor reached deeper into the side pocket of the backpack. What he pulled out made the bar's smoky air feel suddenly colder. It was a small piece of cloth, stiff with dried blood. Razor held it between two fingers, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his jaw said more than words ever could. The little girl gasped, her voice breaking as she stepped forward, clutching at Razor's wrist. "Don't touch that, please. That's my mom's. She gave it to me before they took her." Her body trembled, and tears streamed down her face as she pulled the cloth to her chest, as if it was the last connection she had to the woman in the photograph. Big Joe's voice, usually steady as a rock, carried a gentleness that surprised even his brothers. "Sweetheart, who took your mama?" The girl's small hands shook as she wiped at her cheeks. "Bad men," she whispered. "They came to our house. They yelled at her. They hit her. She told me to run, told me not to look back. She stuffed the money in my bag and gave me the picture. She said if I was brave enough, I'd find someone strong enough to protect me." Her words hit the men like a heavy hammer. These were bikers who had lived on the edge, men who had seen violence and handed out their share of it. But hearing it through the trembling voice of a child was something different. The bar was quiet, only the hum of the jukebox filling the background as each man processed what she had just said. Razor closed the backpack carefully and set it on the counter. He looked around at his brothers, and in his gravelly voice he said, "This isn't just some lost kid. She's running from something real, something big." Diesel, a younger biker with arms as thick as tree trunks, slammed his fist against the table. "And she came here, to us. That means something." His eyes flickered with something that looked a lot like pride. though it was laced with anger too. The girl backed away slightly, her eyes darting nervously to the windows. She hugged the backpack again, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "They'll come," she said quietly, almost to herself. "They'll find me. They always do." Razor crouched to meet her gaze. "Not if we got anything to say about it." He glanced at the other bikers, and though no words passed between them, a silent agreement filled the room. Whatever had happened to this child, whatever danger was on its way, they weren't about to hand her back over. That was when the sound reached them. At first, it was faint, distant, but soon the low rumble grew louder, engines cutting through the night. The biker's eyes flicked toward the windows, where the glare of headlights began to sweep across the dusty glass panes. A moment later, dark shapes emerged in the parking lot. Black vans, doors sliding open, men stepping out. The sound of boots crunching on gravel carried across the night, followed by the unmistakable metallic click of weapons being readied. The girl froze, her face draining of color. She whispered only 2 words, but they were enough to twist every stomach in that bar into knots. "They're here." The bikers shifted, leather creaking as they stood tall. Big Joe reached for the tire iron he kept near the bar. Diesel rolled his shoulders, fists tightening. Razor walked to the door, his expression carved in steel, and slid the heavy bolt across. He turned back to his brothers with a grim smile that carried no fear, only resolve. "Brothers," Razor growled, his voice carrying through the tense silence, "looks like tonight we've got ourselves a war." The girl's breath caught in her throat as the men outside pounded on the bar's door, demanding she be handed over. The bikers formed a wall in front of her, their broad backs shielding her completely from view. She sank to the floor, hugging the pink backpack tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time since she had run, a flicker of hope touched her eyes. She had come searching for someone strong enough, and now, staring at the line of leather-clad giants ready to fight for her, she began to believe she might have found them. The pounding on the door grew louder, rattling the old wood on its hinges. Outside, men shouted threats, their voices muffled but sharp enough to carry a promise of violence. Inside, the bikers of the Iron Claw Brotherhood stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces carved with determination. They had faced fights before, rival gangs, cops who had it out for them, even nights where brawls ended with broken bones and blood on the floor. But this was different. Tonight, they weren't fighting for territory or pride. Tonight, they were standing for a child who had stumbled into their lives and begged them for protection. The little girl crouched on the floor, clutching her pink backpack so tightly it seemed as though her tiny hands would fuse with the fabric. Her wide eyes darted between the door and the men who now formed a human wall in front of her. She could hear the muffled voices outside, the metallic clink of weapons, the growl of engines left idling as if daring the bikers to step outside. Her body trembled, but there was something else beneath the fear, an unspoken trust that these men, strangers with scars and tattoos, would not let her be taken. Razor turned from the door, his scar catching the low light as his jaw clenched. "Nobody touches this kid," he said, his voice low but commanding. "They want her, they're gonna have to go through us first." The other bikers nodded, some cracking their knuckles, others gripping pool cues or chains they had grabbed from the walls. Big Joe lifted a tire iron with ease, his gaze steady and calm, while Diesel twirled a heavy wrench in his hands like it was an extension of his arm. The pounding at the door suddenly stopped, replaced by silence. Then came a voice, slick and cruel, carrying through the cracks in the wood. "We know she's in there. Hand over the girl, and maybe we let you all walk away." The little girl whimpered, burying her face in her knees. Big Joe crouched beside her for a brief moment, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Don't you worry, sweetheart," he whispered. "They ain't getting past us." The silence outside broke with the crash of a heavy object slamming into the door. The bikers braced as the hinges groaned, the wood splintering under repeated blows. Each slam echoed through the bar like a drumbeat of war, steady and inevitable. Razor glanced at his brothers and gave a single nod. The time for waiting was over. When the door finally gave way, shattering inward, the men outside stormed in, their faces masked with aggression, their hands gripping metal pipes and knives. The bar erupted into chaos. Razor was the first to swing, his fist connecting with the jaw of the first thug through the door, sending him sprawling back into the others. Diesel followed with a roar, swinging his wrench in a wide arc that clashed against an attacker's weapon with a metallic clang that vibrated through the room. The fight was brutal and immediate. Chairs toppled, bottles shattered, fists flew. The bikers moved with practiced fury, each man fighting not just for himself, but for the little girl huddled in the corner. She covered her ears as the sounds of violence filled the bar, grunts, curses, the crash of wood splintering, the metallic ring of weapons colliding. Big Joe grabbed one thug by the collar and slammed him onto a table so hard the legs cracked beneath the weight. Another biker, Snake, used his chain like a whip, sending men stumbling back with every strike. Razor fought like a storm, his scarred face twisted in focus, each punch and kick precise, fueled not by anger alone, but by a protective rage he had never felt before. Despite their numbers, the men who had come for the girl hadn't expected such resistance. They were used to people cowering, to fear opening doors instead of barricading them. Here, they found a wall of leather and steel, men who refused to give an inch. Still, the attackers pressed forward, determined to tear through the line. In the middle of the chaos, the girl lifted her head just enough to peek between her fingers. What she saw stunned her. These men, strangers she had once thought terrifying, were fighting like warriors. Not for money, not for revenge, but for her. Razor locked eyes with her for a split second, even as he shoved an attacker backward, and in that look she read a promise. "You're safe." The battle raged on, each moment stretching longer than the last. Dust from the old wooden beams filled the air as the bar itself seemed to groan under the strain of the fight. Glass shattered near the girl's feet, but Big Joe stepped in front of her just in time, using his body as a shield without hesitation. He swung his tire iron again, and the thug threatening her crumpled to the ground. Slowly, the balance began to shift. The bikers' unity, their sheer refusal to break, started to wear down the attackers. One by one, the men who had come in confident and sneering began to falter. Some staggered back toward the broken doorway, clutching bruised ribs or split lips. Razor grabbed the nearest thug by the collar and growled into his face, "Tell your boss she's under our protection now. You want her, you'll have to bury every last one of us." With that, he shoved the man out the door, sending him sprawling onto the gravel outside. The others followed, retreating under the weight of the bikers' fury. The engines roared again as the black vans pulled back, leaving behind a trail of dust and the echo of their defeat. Inside the bar, the silence was deafening after the chaos. The bikers stood breathing hard, bruised and bloodied, but victorious. Razor wiped a smear of blood from his cheek and turned to the little girl, who was still huddled against the wall, her backpack clutched to her chest. Diesel crouched down, his voice gentle despite his massive frame. "They're gone, kid, you're safe, for now." The girl lifted her face slowly, her eyes wide and shining with tears, but this time there was something else in them. Relief, hope. For the first time in a long while, she felt the faint but powerful sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. The bar smelled of sweat, smoke, and broken wood as the dust slowly settled from the chaos. Tables had been overturned, bottles smashed into glittering shards across the floor, and the jukebox had gone silent under the force of the fight. The bikers stood battered but unbroken, their broad chests heaving with exhaustion. The little girl was still pressed against the wall, her pink backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. Her wide eyes studied the men around her, men who just minutes ago had been strangers, but who had fought like lions to keep her safe. Razor wiped a streak of blood from his lip and spat on the floor, his scar catching the dim light. He glanced toward the shattered doorway where the attackers had retreated into the night. "They'll be back," he muttered, his voice low and certain. "This ain't over." Big Joe set his tire iron down with a heavy clang and crouched next to the girl. He spoke softly, his gravelly voice unusually tender. "Sweetheart, we need to know what they want with you and your mama. We can't protect you if we don't know the truth." The girl looked down at her knees, her small fingers twisting into the fabric of her backpack. For a long moment, she didn't speak. The silence stretched until it seemed unbearable, and then she whispered, barely audible. "My mom, she was working for them. She didn't want to, but they made her. They hurt her until she did what they said." Razor's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Working how?" The girl's eyes filled with tears as she tried to explain. "She cleaned their houses, ran their errands, but then they started making her do more. She found out where they kept their money. She told me they were dangerous men who would never stop hurting people, so she took some of it. She said it was the only way we could run away and start over." She unzipped the bag just enough to show the thick envelope of cash again. "That's why they want us. That's why they took her." The room grew heavy with silence. The bikers exchanged looks, reading each other's thoughts without a word. They all knew what kind of men would send vans full of armed thugs after a woman and her child. Men with power, men who would not stop until they got what they wanted. Diesel slammed his wrench down on the counter, the wood splintering under the blow. "So they'll keep coming, and if they got her, they ain't gonna let her live long." The girl whimpered, curling into herself as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "She told me to run. She said if I found someone strong enough, I'd be safe. She said she'd find me later, but what if she doesn't?" Her voice broke on the last word. Razor crouched in front of her, his rough hands resting on his knees. His expression was stern, but his eyes carried something different now, an understanding she hadn't expected to see. "Kid, listen to me. Your mom risked everything to get you out. That tells me she's still fighting, and if she's fighting, then we're fighting too. You hear me?" She nodded weakly, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve. The other bikers gathered closer, forming a circle around her like a wall of protection. Snake coiled his chain around his arm and smirked darkly. "So what's the plan, Razor? We just wait here for another wave of clowns to storm the door?" Razor stood and looked around the wrecked bar, his gaze sweeping over the shattered glass and broken chairs. His voice came hard and sure. "No, we take the fight to them." The men grinned grimly, their bruised faces lighting up with the thrill of a challenge. These were men who had spent their lives fighting battles others would have run from. But this time it wasn't about pride or territory. This was about a little girl and her mother. This was about showing the world that the Iron Claw Brotherhood wasn't just a name, it was a promise. The girl looked up at them with a mix of fear and wonder. She had expected bikers to be scary, cruel even. Instead, she saw a family of men who had already risked themselves for her. And now they were willing to go further, to face down the kind of danger that had haunted her dreams. Big Joe knelt again, his massive hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "We're gonna find your mama, kid. That's a promise, and nobody breaks promises in this bar." Her lip trembled as she nodded, clutching the backpack tighter. For the first time since she had run into the bar, her tears slowed. The bikers began gathering what they could use: chains, bats, knives tucked into belts. They moved with purpose, each man fueled by a mix of anger and loyalty. Razor gave orders like a commander, his voice carrying through the room. "Snake, you're on lookout. Diesel, get the bikes ready. Joe, you stay with the kid until we know it's safe to move her." The sound of engines growled to life outside, echoing through the night like a war drum. The little girl pressed her face against the window, watching as the men she had stumbled upon turned into an army. Her heart pounded, not from fear this time, but from something unfamiliar: hope. As Razor adjusted his gloves and swung his leg over his bike, he glanced back at her one more time. "Sit tight, kid. We'll bring her back. That's a promise." Then, with a roar of engines and a trail of dust, the bikers vanished into the night, chasing the shadows where her mother was being held captive. The girl sank into Big Joe's arms, clutching her backpack, whispering a silent prayer. She had trusted her mother's words, trusted that she would find someone strong enough to protect her. And now, as the growl of motorcycles faded into the distance, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, her mother would be coming home. The night stretched long and heavy, every minute dragging like an hour for the little girl who waited anxiously inside the wrecked bar. She sat curled in one of the least damaged booths, her pink backpack clutched tightly against her chest, her small face buried into the fabric as though it could shield her from the world. Big Joe sat nearby, silent, his massive frame slouched but alert, one hand resting on the handle of the bat he had used earlier. He kept glancing toward the door, his ears tuned to the faintest sound of engines returning. The girl had cried herself into quiet hiccups, then into silence, her tiny body exhausted, though her eyes remained open and wide, fixed on that door. She whispered to herself every so often, repeating her mother's words, that she would be safe if she found strong people. Those words were the only thing keeping her from collapsing into despair. Then, after what felt like forever, the distant growl of engines cut through the stillness of the night. The girl's head shot up, her eyes shimmering with both fear and anticipation. Big Joe's lips curved into a small smile, and he muttered, "They're back." The sound grew louder, closer, until the rumble filled the air like a storm. A few moments later, the bar door swung open, and the bikers stepped inside, bloodied, bruised, but victorious. At their center was Razor, his leather jacket torn at the shoulder, and walking beside him, clutching his arm with trembling fingers, was a woman with tired eyes and a face that bore the marks of struggle. Her clothes were dirty, her hair matted, but her expression lit up the moment she saw the little girl. The girl dropped her backpack and ran forward, her small feet echoing on the wooden floor as she cried out, "Mom!" The woman stumbled forward, tears streaming down her face as she fell to her knees and wrapped her arms around her daughter. The two clung to each other desperately, sobbing as though the world had finally allowed them to breathe again. The bikers looked on in silence, their rough exteriors softening at the sight of the reunion. Even Snake, who often wore nothing but a smirk, found himself turning his gaze away, as though the purity of the moment was too much for him to handle. Razor approached slowly, his boots thudding across the floor. He placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, steadying her as she cried, "You're safe now. They won't touch you again, not while we're breathing." His voice was firm, carrying the weight of a vow that no one doubted he would keep. The woman lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes full of gratitude and disbelief. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't need to," Big Joe replied, standing tall behind her. "Your little girl did all the hard work. She found us. She made sure we couldn't look the other way." The girl buried her face in her mother's chest, her muffled voice breaking through the sobs. "I told you I'd find strong people, Mama. I told you." Her mother kissed the top of her head again and again, whispering back promises of never letting go. The bikers began picking up the broken pieces of their bar, righting tables and sweeping away glass, but none of them left the woman and child unattended. They kept a circle around them, watchful eyes on the door and windows, because even in victory, they knew danger could return. Still, the weight in the room had shifted. Where earlier there had been tension and fear, now there was relief, even pride. The Iron Claw Brotherhood had faced down something ugly and emerged not just as fighters, but as protectors. As the night bled into dawn, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the broken blinds, painting the mother and daughter in a soft golden glow. Razor leaned against the bar, lighting a cigarette, though his eyes remained on the pair. When the girl looked up at him, her face streaked with tears but glowing with relief, she whispered, "Thank you." Razor gave her a rare smile, the kind that softened the hard edges of his scarred face. "Don't thank me, kid. Thank your mom. She was strong enough to believe you deserved a better life. We just gave her a little backup." The girl nodded solemnly, hugging her mother tighter. For the first time in a long while, she believed that the nightmare might truly be over. By the time the sun had fully risen, plans were already being made. The bikers spoke of places the mother and daughter could go, safe houses where the gang would never find them, people they could trust to help them start again. The woman hesitated at first, not wanting to burden the men further, but Razor silenced her with a simple shake of his head. "Your family now. We don't abandon family." The word family seemed to linger in the air, wrapping itself around everyone in the room. These men, hardened by years of fighting and living on the edge, had been changed by the arrival of a frightened child with a pink backpack. In protecting her, they had rediscovered something worth more than pride or power. They had found purpose. When it was time for the woman and her daughter to rest, Big Joe carried the girl to a cot in the back room, her backpack tucked safely at her side. She was asleep before her head even touched the pillow, her small body finally able to relax. Her mother sat beside her, holding her hand, unwilling to let go even for a moment. The bikers lingered nearby, their voices low, their presence reassuring. They knew the road ahead would not be easy for the mother and daughter, but they also knew they would never again face it alone. The Iron Claw Bar, once a place of chaos and rough nights, had become a fortress of safety, a symbol of protection. And as Razor stepped outside into the morning light, he looked back through the door at the sleeping girl and her mother. A rare peace settled over him, and he muttered to himself, "Strong people, huh? Guess she was right." Then he flicked away his cigarette, the smoke curling into the dawn sky, and walked back inside to where his brothers waited, ready for whatever came next.